Aloha, welcome once again to Kdubsplace. It is February 28th, 2016. We're going to go over a little episode that appeared here on Kauai a little while ago. It was a big thrill in my life, and I'd like to tell you about it right now. In the spring of 1997, I got a call from my pal Edd Cook, who had played bass and sax with me on many occasions. I had heard that Bill Kreutzmann, drummer of the Grateful Dead, had moved, at least for the time being, to Kauai and had been seen around and had been dropping by gigs and jamming a bit with the natives. Ed, who was quite the Deadhead, had befriended him and said that Wild Bill wanted to get a band together. For some reason, a guy named Rick had been recruited to be the guitar player, and it was decided that a keyboard player would be the right thing to fill up the lineup. So even though I wasn't the best on the keys around town, Ed figured that they needed more in the way of vocals, so he gave me the call. He asked me if I wanted to join a band with Bill Kreutzmann, Rick, and himself. I had a little concern about the Rick part of it, but play with a Rock and Roll Hall of Famer? Of course, I would be honored to join the gang. So the plan was to rehearse for 2 or 3 weeks before doing our first gig out on the west side at a fairly small private birthday party that had already been set up. In the meantime, we'd set up other gigs to follow and keep rolling on down the road. Kreutzmann had rented a house down by the beach in Kapa'a, and it was there that our rehearsals took place. First day we were to get together, I went by the store, got a 12-pack of beer, and went to the house a little early so that I could meet Bill on my own without any weird introductions from the other two. After exchanging pleasantries, I told him I wasn't a real fancy keyboard guy, just a folk rock guy. He said he was just a folk rock guy himself, and proceeded to make me feel comfortable around him. I started setting my gear up, and the others appeared at some point. When everyone was in the rehearsal room, I presented the 12-pack of Budweiser for our joint consideration. They all looked rather sheepishly at one another, and someone, well, probably Ed, said that I should go ahead and drink them, but that the three of them were in AA, and so they'd pass. I couldn't believe it. I had just joined a rock and roll band that didn't drink. After Jerry Garcia had died the year before, I guess the contemplation of his own mortality had hit Kreutzmann hard, and he had come to... excuse me, it's early in the morning here. He had come to Kauai partly to clean out his system after having seriously abused it for the last 35 years or so. Now he was on the wagon and going to AA. What was the world coming to? I hadn't seen the other two guys for quite a while, so I didn't know their reasons for getting on that same wagon. All I know is that I felt suddenly alone. I had a momentary notion to throw back a few buds anyway, but thought better of it and took them home where they'd be more appreciated. Initially, we had two things to decide. What were we going to play? What were we going to call ourselves? Bill didn't really care much about either question. He just wanted to play. So the others and I started throwing out songs, and we started playing. There were a couple of musician friends of mine who had seen our drummer jamming around the island and were not very impressed. When we first started trying to find our groove, I'll admit that Wild Bill seemed a little rusty. But once we figured out a few things then it was all very cool. He said he was a folk rock guy, but as you would know if you've ever seen the Dead in concert, he's much more than that. Of course, all that would come to the surface once we started the improvisational passages in our songs. The way he could lead us through those passages was something I'd never experienced before with a drummer, and it seemed like we were stumbling into something very unique and quite possibly might even be good. The only thing that really concerned me, other than the sobriety issue, was the material that we'd be playing. Kreutzmann had taken quite a liking to our guitar players playing, and even his original songs, I guess. Rick was a good guitar player, but his songs were, well, kind of pretty mediocre blues-based tunes. Not really very original in my humble opinion, but Bill thought otherwise, so I kept my mouth shut. And as much as it may have seemed like the guitar player was starting to consider himself the leader of our combo, the moment our drummer would open his mouth about anything, that's the way it would be. So we ended up playing a lot of Rick's tunes. As for me, I threw some old stuff that I thought we could do well into the mix. I had the notion to start coming up with bits that we could mold into our own original material, but at the beginning I laid pretty low, waiting to see what was going to happen. And besides, I was the last one to join, so I felt I was in no position to be strong-arming my ideas on everyone. We did end up working on my reggae rock kind of thing called Higher Sound, which I wrote and performed with the Shakers reggae band, but I don't know if we ever played it in one of our own shows. Bill gave it a strange kind of rhythm that I could never figure out if I liked or not. I introduced Not Fade Away, which the band had played a lot over the years, or which the Dead had played a lot over the years. And I also threw in The Shape I'm In by the band, and we did that one real good. Before the second rehearsal, I was talking to Ed, and he asked me if I thought Bill would mind playing some Grateful Dead tunes. Well, I suggested we ask him, and we did the next day. He said sure, he'd be glad to. That's when things changed for the better, and our identity started to form. Yes. People would probably come to see us anyway because of the drummer, but if we put a few Dead songs in there, it would raise the roof. It also, from my perspective, would make playing these blues shuffles of the guitar players a lot easier to handle. So we threw together Scarlet Begonias, Fire on the Mountain, and I offered to sing Bertha. I know there must have been others too. We even started doing that thing the Dead did, where they'd do one song, then do this improvisational bit, which would change rhythm and get strange for a while before getting into the next song. That was when I saw that cool thing that Kreutzmann did so well, where he'd break it down after the first song, lead us through that improvisational bit, and lead us once again into the steady rhythm of the next song. It was quite something. The funny thing about this was the guitar player didn't know a thing about the music of the Grateful Dead. If he had, maybe it could have been a better presentation, although it might have been the reason that Bill liked him, not acting like a fan and all. Who knows? Anyway, our little unit was starting to gel, and I felt better and better about it every rehearsal. The second matter on the band agenda was what to call ourselves. We might have thrown some ideas out in a group discussion, but it was decided that we should take the question home with us, think about it, and return with suggestions at the next gathering. That night, I made sure I got home and got good and stoned before sitting down to collect some options. I came up with over 50 names while listening to Working Man's Dead and American Beauty. Until the flood deprived me of all my memorabilia in 2008, I would look at that sheet of paper with 50 names from time to time, just for a laugh. Of course, some ideas were better than others, but I thought I had a few that might make the cut. That's one of the most exciting moments in the life of a band, coming up with the right name. When it's there, everybody knows it. That's what happened with us. We were there at rehearsal, barking out names that we had considered, when all of a sudden, there it was. And the funny thing was, the suggestion came from Rick, the guy who didn't know anything about the Grateful Dead. He said, I've got another one. How about Backbone? At that moment, the clouds parted. The trumpets heralded a new beginning, and the boys had their name. There was no use going any further. We had found perfection in our new title. Seeing as how the drummer is generally thought of as the backbone of any band, and seeing as how the skeletal imagery is prevalent in Grateful Dead lore, it was right on the money, so to speak. Okay, so now we have some songs and a cool name. Let's play. Our first gig was a private birthday out on the west side of Kauai. Someone in the band knew the birthday boy, and I believe he was turning 50 at the time. We had set up this gig primarily to get out in front of people just to see if we could hold it together in public. That part of it went well. We were to do our first public show the following week at the historic Tahiti Nui in Honolulu, which was bound to be a crazy scene, so it's good that we did the private party first in order to iron out the kinks, so to speak. Bill added some entertainment for my benefit as we were setting up the gear. Through the rehearsals, he had been drumming on a modest, small drum set compared to the humongous bunch of drums and cymbals that he always used when playing with Garcia and company. He brought that small set with him on the first gigs we did. While setting up for the birthday party, he said a couple of things that made me laugh and feel honored at the same time. Okay. First, he said it was the first time in over 30 years that he had played sober. Then he said it was also the first time in over 30 years that he had set up his own drums. Wow. Now, if you know anything about being a professional drummer, you know that except for fusion jazz or really fast metal, the drumming part of it is fairly straight ahead and not too much of a chore. You might work up a sweat, but as long as you start on time and end on time, it usually is easy enough to fake the rest. Of course, the downside of being a drummer is setting up all that crap and, even worse, tearing it all down at the end of the night, while you watch the sax player put his axe into a little case and walk away, envy kicks in and you realize you're going to be around for quite a while, disassembling all the cymbal hardware and putting everything in the multiple cases that lie before you. And that's what Kreutzmann discovered at the end of our birthday gig. He was swearing under his breath and getting visibly shaken by the tediousness of the process, so much so that in between that gig and our next one in Honolulu the following week, he flew over his Grateful Dead roadie from the Bay Area to set up his little drum set for the future shows. So not only was that the first time he set up his drums in over 30 years, it was the only time he set them up in that amount of time. It was a historic event that I got to witness with my own eyes. So, one gig down. Now we start preparing for our first public presentation. The test run had gone through smooth enough, aside from Kreutzmann's consternation over setting up his own drums. Sometime during the week, my buddy Richard, while we were watching a Laker game, no doubt, asked me if I thought our new band would like to back up Jackson Browne for a concert designed to raise funds for the new community radio station, KKCR, which Richard had shepherded into existence. The next day, I went to the rehearsal a little early to talk to Wild Bill about the possibility. When I mentioned backing up Jackson, he said, "I don't think I can play pop music." At first I thought it was a funny thing to say. Then when I thought more about it later, I think I started to understand what he was talking about. And Jackson Browne, other than Doctor My Eyes, has never really made much of an impact on the top 40 chart. So as you and I might figured it, he couldn't really be considered a pop star in the normal sense. What I think our famous drummer was referring to was the fact that Jackson's songs are all pretty much the same from a rhythmical standpoint. One may be faster or slower than the next, but they pretty much all had the same 4/4 beat, leaving little room for a drummer to get creative. I could probably do the job just fine myself. And whereas I thought the notion of being on stage with one of my favorite singer-songwriters would be very cool, it didn't do anything for Bill, who envisioned it as a human drum machine kind of deal. So I dropped the whole idea. I don't even think I brought it up to the other guys in the band. As it turned out, the concert didn't end up happening around then anyway. When it did come together later in the year, Richard ended up getting another group of guys who I had done numerous gigs with over the years for the backup band. Funny thing is, those cats didn't really know much about Jackson's songs, whereas I was well versed on his entire catalog. And there was no one to add vocal harmonies at the concert, which I could have brought to the table. Anyway, the concert ended up being a great success and was graced by the presence and performance of Nicolette Larson, who sadly died not long after that, and her husband Russ Kunkel, who was one of my favorite drummers. He only played the congas on a song or two, but it was still cool, and for me, I ended up carrying everyone else's equipment. Okay, so where was I? Oh yeah, Backbone was about ready to go public. There wasn't much else of interest during that week, just a couple of rehearsals, I imagine. But it was starting to look like it was going to be a big deal. If you know much about Kauai, or even if you don't, you can probably imagine the popularity of the Grateful Dead here. And as far as I know, this was the first band that Bill Kreutzmann had been a part of since the Deadheads ceased to play as a result of Jerry Garcia's death. So the newspaper put out the word with a lovely photo of the four of us. Probably should have been just a picture of Bill, for the natives had seen enough of us three chumps by that time. Still, it was an exciting week that led up to the greatest gig of my humble career. Ah, the Tahiti Nui. Many of my favorite times as a performing musician and singer were spent on that stage. When we got there to set our equipment up, there were already people waiting to get inside. I don't remember that ever happening before with any other band I'd ever played with. Kauai is a very small place, and being a professional musician, and having played pretty much everywhere, from Hyanna to the missile base, it seems like I must have, although I'm sure it's not that accurate, seen everybody at least once. The night that Backbone played the Nui, I think every hippie living out in the wilderness must have forgotten their pot patches to get a glimpse of the Grateful Dead's drummer. And there were numerous faces I'd never seen before, probably even people from off island. There was quite a long line out on the street that you couldn't see the end of. And there were no pre-show tickets being sold, so I imagine everybody expected to get in. Tough luck, that. But the showroom of the Nui had these big windows that would open up, so the parking lot became another gathering place for the spillover. I'm pretty sure that smoking was still allowed in public buildings back then, so opening these windows was generally necessary anyway. It was a madhouse. I think they must have taken out all the tables because there were more bodies in there than I've ever seen, and I've seen some big nights up there. Upon the first beat, the crowd went wild. Everyone was partying like there was no tomorrow, and when we kicked into the Dead material, the roof appeared to lift off. There was, of course, a lot of drinking going on, but that wasn't all they were doing. There was a constant sweet fragrance permeating throughout the room, and trust me, there was a fair share of hallucinating taking place as well. There was way too much creative dancing going on for there not to be. As for me, I was pretty straight until after the show. I must have had a Budweiser or two during the professional part of the evening, but I kept it pretty low-key so that I could make sure that I held up my side of the stage in good fashion. Of course, the other three cats weren't drinking at all, so I had that added peer pressure. We played great, including the previous private party. I did 4 gigs with Backbone before quitting, or if you ask the other 3, being fired. We'll get to that later. Of the 4 gigs, this one was by far the best. That night at the Tahiti Nui was a magical one for us as a band, at least for the 3 of us small-time guys. Everything clicked, even the guitar player's songs. Well, they were pretty easy to play. The only thing that bothered me was that the guitar player decided to set up 2 amplifiers, one behind him, which is the accepted way of doing things, and one on the opposite side of the stage, behind me. I've played with a number of egocentric guitar players in my life, but none of them ever did that. It took me a while to ignore it because, well, after all, it was right in my ear. But eventually, that didn't faze me too much because everything else was so cool. For 3 hours, we were rock stars. After our encores were played and the lights came on and we were packing up the gear, a beautiful 23 or so year old girl with long blonde hair came over to me and said that she'd follow me anywhere. There wasn't anyone else in close proximity, so I assumed she was talking to me. She had her eyes pointed in my direction, but who knows what she was seeing. I told her that if she didn't mind sticking around while I got my stuff loaded up, we could discuss the possibilities. As she stood there with what I would call a faraway look in her eyes, I began thinking that this is why I'd been slogging through the life of a small-time professional musician for so long. This was the night that was going to make it all make sense. A couple of minutes later, the drummer for the Grateful Dead walked off the stage and out the door. She and about 15 others walked right out behind him, and I never saw her again. But that was alright. For a few moments, I experienced the feeling you must get at the summit of Mount Everest. The pinnacle of something, but I'm not sure what. To top off, it was already a near perfect gig, aside from that guitar amp parked in my space. I was handed $400 in cash. Now, most of the music cats I know who have worked as pros for a long time have made a lot more dough than that for a single gig. But I've never had the business savvy to get that much more before my eyes at one time. I gladly stuffed the wad in my pocket, got in my car, and had a glorious ride home. Things were never quite the same after that, not in terms of my life improving, but in terms of the tension that was starting to brew between the guitar player and myself. My guess is that he didn't even know anything was up with me because his head had swollen up so after that first big triumphant gig. I survived 2 more gigs with those guys. The next one was in a large hotel ballroom, and even though it was an acceptable turnout by my standards, the room was so big that it lacked the excitement of the Tahiti Nui. We played all right, I guess, but there were things going on stage that were starting to piss me off. The guitar player, who had shortcomings when it came to leading a band, if that's what his intention was starting to not give cues when things would change during any given song, like taking a solo or bringing the vocal back in. For anyone reading this who's not familiar with band chemistry on stage, it might be hard to understand, but it resulted in me not coming in or dropping out at the right time, and this resulted in me looking like I didn't know what was going on, which was partially true, I guess. Anyway, it was incompetent band leadership and quickly became a pain in the ass. It got so bad at our last gig together that I knew it had to stop. But Bill still thought the guitar guy was the bee's knees, as they say, and Ed wanted to hang with Bill, so it became a 3 against 1 kind of situation. Edd and I were still pals and remain so to this day. But the morning following our fourth gig, I called him and left a message saying that I was not going to show up for the meeting or rehearsal or whatever it was that we had planned to do later that day. About an hour later, I was standing in line at Burger King when Edd showed up and said that I was being fired. So, technically speaking, I think I quit first, but it didn't really matter. During our time together, Bill Kreutzmann was very cool toward me, and it was a highlight of my life as a musician to have shared a few stages with him. I don't think I ever saw the guitar player again, but if I did, I probably wouldn't remember anyway. Backbone played for a little while after that. Of course, the guitar guy wanted to go out and tour and be a big star, but Bill didn't want any part of that. They did put an album together, and Kreutzmann took them over for a show in San Francisco, as well as arranged for the album to be released on the Grateful Dead album, I believe. He also fell off the wagon not long after that. I never heard the album. Hell,